Welcome to our deep dive today. We are going to be exploring a really fascinating essay
Yeah.
called Still Here, Still Queer, Neuroqueerness, Utopia, and the End of Empire
Yes.
by Jaime Hoerricks.
That's right.
And this deep dive is really about kind of envisioning a future
Yeah.
that's different from the world we live in now. And the author, Jaime Hoerricks, I
Okay.
hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly.
You are.
I believe they use they, them
You
pronouns.
do.
Uses their own experience as a neuroqueer person to kind of critique some of the systems that are in place and to offer a different vision forward.
Yeah, it's less about surviving the present and more about, creating a different kind of future one that really challenges, the foundations of power as we know it.
Yeah,
And it really pushes the boundaries of what we typically think of when we talk about social change.
absolutely. And one thing that struck me right away, and I'd love to get your take on this, is this feeling of exhaustion that Horrocks describes. They talk about it as not just being tired, but like a weariness that comes from constantly navigating a world that wasn't built for them, for anyone who doesn't fit into the expected norms.
Right. It's like trying to squeeze into a space that's just not made for you. It takes a lot of energy and it can be incredibly draining.
Uh-huh.
And that's the experience that Horrocks is highlighting. And they connect that to the demands of a world that wasn't designed for queer individuals,
Yeah.
especially those who are neurodivergent.
Yeah, it's that square peg in a round hole kind of feeling, like
Yep.
constantly trying to force yourself to fit in, and it's just not working.
Right.
And so Horrocks talks about, being neuroqueer, and they argue that this feeling of exhaustion is even more pronounced for people who challenge the dominant way of doing things just by existing.
Yeah. And that's where the concept of neuroqueerness comes in. It's not about trying to fit into a system that's not working. It's about embracing fluidity and rejecting those rigid structures that are causing so much exhaustion in the first place.
Yeah, and this idea of queerness beyond survival is how they frame it in the essay.
Right.
And they draw very heavily on the work of Jose Esteban Munoz,
Yes.
particularly his book Cruising Utopia, where he talks about queerness as a force for creating a more utopian future.
Right. The idea is that queerness isn't just about resisting the present. It's about actively building a future that goes beyond the limitations of what we have now. And Horrocks takes that idea and runs with it, suggesting that this future can't be achieved through assimilation.
And that brings us to the next big point in the essay, the false promises of assimilation. There's a real sense of frustration with how the mainstream LGBTQ plus movement has focused on fitting into existing systems rather than creating something new.
Yeah. Horrocks is very critical of groups like the Human Rights Campaign and their focus on respectability politics. It's like they're saying, if we act enough like the dominant group, they'll finally accept us. But the essay argues that this approach ignores the more radical potential of queerness to create real transformative change.
And they give some specific examples, like from 2007, where the HRC supported a version of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act
Right.
that did not protect transgender people,
Great.
arguing that it was a more pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
And then you have the push for marriage equality, which, while a huge milestone, the essay argues, it ultimately fell short of true liberation.
Right. It's like the movement was so focused on being seen as normal and acceptable that it missed the opportunity to really challenge the systems that were causing harm in the first place. And that's a dangerous game to play because it reinforces the idea that the only way to be valued is to conform to the norms of the dominant group. And that leaves very little space for anyone who doesn't fit that mold.
Absolutely. And I think about the rise in anti-trans legislation and sentiment that we're seeing in recent years. It's like the movement's focus on respectability left it totally unprepared to deal with this backlash. It's
Right.
almost like by trying so hard to fit in, they lost sight of the power that comes from embracing difference.
It really makes you think about the limitations of assimilation as a strategy for social change. Is it really about blending in, or is it about creating something entirely new, something that doesn't require us to compromise who we are?
It's a huge question.
Yeah.
And it leads us to the next section of the essay, which is where things get really interesting. I think neuroqueerness and capitalist time.
Oh, yeah. This section's mind-bending.
Yeah.
Hoerricks talks about their own experience of time as an autistic person,
Hmm.
and it really challenges the very foundation of how we typically think about time.
It is wild. They describe it as being nonlinear, where memories are stored as patterns rather than a chronological order. Like there's this quote where they say, "For me, memories are not filed away in a chronological sequence, but stored as gestalts, patterns of meaning, moments that reconfigure themselves the instant new context emerges."
Yeah, it's like suddenly seeing the world in 3D after only ever knowing 2D. Instead of this straight line from past to present to future time, is more fluid, more interconnected.
And that just explodes the capitalist idea of a fixed self and linear progress.
Exactly.
Because if time isn't this rigid forward-marching thing, then maybe our identities aren't fixed either.
Right. It makes you wonder how much of our understanding of time is actually just a product of a system that wants us to measure and compartmentalize every aspect of our lives. Capitalism thrives on efficiency and productivity, and that requires a very specific way of thinking about time.
It's making me rethink my own relationship with time. Have I
Yeah.
bought into these capitalist ideas about productivity so much that I've lost touch with other ways of experiencing the world?
It's something to think about for sure.
Have you ever felt that pressure to conform to a certain pace or a certain way of thinking?
Absolutely. The pressure to be constantly productive,
Yeah.
to stick to deadlines, to measure our worth by how much we achieve in a given time frame,
Right.
it's everywhere. But this exploration of neuroqueer temporality suggests that there are other ways of relating to time that are just as valid.
Yeah, it's like we've been given a limited set of tools to understand the world.
Right.
And this essay is saying, hey, there are whole other toolboxes out there we
Absolutely.
haven't even considered.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And that brings us to, I think, the next big idea that Hoerricks tackles queerness as the antidote to empire.
Oh, yeah. Get ready for another mind-blowing shift in perspective. This idea that queerness can be like an antidote to empire.
Yeah.
And that's a really powerful concept.
It is.
It's not just about like resisting or opposing these systems of power. It's more about dismantling the very logic that those systems are built on.
Yeah, it's like queerness is this glitch in the matrix.
Yeah.
Revealing the code that's been running in the background this whole time.
Exactly. And Hoerricks uses this really striking historical example to kind of illustrate this point. And they talk about drapetomania.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
I'll admit I had to look that one up.
Um,
Drapetomania was this supposed mental illness that was diagnosed in enslaved people who wanted to escape from slavery.
yeah, and it sounds absurd now, right?
Totally.
But it really shows how systems of power use labels like mental illness to control people
Mm.
and maintain the status quo.
Right.
Anything that threatens the established order, anything that deviates from the norm, gets pathologized.
Right.
It's labeled as sick or wrong.
So if wanting freedom is a mental illness, then the system itself is inherently sick.
Exactly.
And that logic, it's still at play today, isn't
Oh,
it?
absolutely. Think about how trans identities and neurodivergence are still pathologized today.
Yeah.
It's the same impulse to control and categorize people to enforce conformity.
It's like we're told that we need to fit into these neat little boxes. And if we don't, then there's something wrong with us. But what if the boxes themselves are the problem?
Right.
What if the real sickness is this obsession with control and conformity?
That's the question that Hoerricks is asking us to really grapple with.
Right.
And they suggest that queerness, and especially neuroqueerness, has a vital role to play in dismantling those boxes and disrupting those systems of control.
I love that line from the essay where they say, queer as in knowing that the desire to escape enslavement was once classified as a mental illness drapetomania because freedom itself was seen as pathological. It's just this really stark reminder that what's considered normal is often just what's convenient for those in power.
Right. And what's fascinating is that Hoerricks goes beyond just the critique. They actually offer a vision for a different kind of future, a future that embraces neurodiversity and really challenges those foundations of, capitalist time and control.
Yeah, I love this part because it gets really hopeful. It's not just about what we're fighting against, it's also about what we're fighting for.
Exactly. And they use this term neuroqueering to describe this process of disrupting both neuronormativity and heteronormativity at the same time.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's about breaking down those rigid categories and hierarchies that define who's normal and who's not.
It's like saying, hey, the way we've been doing things isn't working for a lot of people. Let's try something different. And that something different is informed by the unique experiences and perspectives of neurodivergent individuals.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the inherent value and potential of neurodiversity. The essay argues that neuroqueer individuals with their different ways of thinking, experiencing time, relating to the world, they offer these valuable insights that can help us imagine and create a more just and equitable future.
I love that idea of like neuroqueerness being this kind of superpower.
Yeah.
This way of seeing the world that allows us to challenge assumptions and break free from those limitations of dominant ways of thinking.
It's about embracing the fluidity and complexity of identity.
Yes.
Recognizing that we're not these fixed static beings, but we're constantly evolving and becoming. And it challenges that capitalist notion of a fixed self,
Right.
a self that must be measured and categorized and optimized for productivity.
And Hoerricks argues that, this capitalist obsession with control and efficiency is inherently hostile to queerness and neurodiversity.
Right.
It just can't tolerate anything that doesn't fit neatly into its predefined boxes.
Yeah, it's like those old computer programs that would crash if you entered the wrong command.
Yeah.
The system just wasn't built to handle anything outside of its very narrow parameters. And in a way, that's what neuroqueer folks are doing. They're entering those unexpected commands,
Yeah.
disrupting the program, revealing its limitations.
They're like these glitches in the system that make you realize that the system itself is flawed and there are other ways of doing things.
Exactly. And that's where I think the real power of this deep dive lies. It's not just about critique, it's about possibility. It's about recognizing that we have the power to imagine and create a world that's more equitable and more aligned with our values.
It's call to action for all of us, regardless of our identities, to embrace our differences, to challenge the status quo, and to build a future where everyone can thrive.
And to do that, we need to dismantle the systems of oppression that have been holding us back for so long. Systems like colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, which rely on control hierarchy and the exploitation of marginalized groups.
And Hoerricks argues that queerness, and particularly neuroqueerness, has this vital role to play in this process of dismantling.
Right.
And they highlight the ways in which these systems have historically used psychiatry as a tool of control, pathologizing anything that deviates from the norm.
Right. Whether it was the desire for freedom amongst enslaved people or the expression of gender identity and neurodiversity today, it's the same tactic of labeling difference as a problem, as something that needs to be fixed or controlled.
It's a reminder that the fight for liberation is not just about changing laws and policies. It's about challenging the very frameworks that define what's considered normal and what's deemed deviant.
It's about reclaiming our power to define ourselves, our identities, and our realities. And it's about recognizing that our differences are not deficits, but sources of strength, creativity, and resilience.
So instead of trying to fit into a system that was never designed for us, we need to start building the world we want to see. A world that celebrates those differences and sees them as assets, not liabilities.
And Hoerricks reminds us that we're not alone in this. There's a growing movement of people who are embracing their neurodiversity, challenging norms, and creating spaces where everyone can be their authentic selves.
It's not just about surviving.
Yeah.
It's about thriving.
Exactly.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential regardless of their differences.
And that brings us to the final section of Hoerricks' essay, where they outline this bold vision for a queer future, a future that's already taking shape in the cracks of the old world.
Okay, so we've really been unpacking a lot in this deep dive,
Yeah.
ideas about exhaustion and assimilation and neuroqueerness and empire. But I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what Hoerricks is trying to convey in this essay.
It is dense material for sure.
Yeah.
But there's this real sense of urgency and hope that runs through it.
Uh-huh.
It's not just like a critique of, what's wrong with the world. It's a call to action.
Right.
It's a manifesto for creating something radically different.
And that's what I kind of want to dig into in this final section.
Right.
Hoerricks doesn't just leave us hanging with all these big complex ideas.
Right.
They offer this roadmap,
Yeah.
a set of principles for building a future that those in power can't even imagine, let alone control.
Right.
So what are some of the key principles of this manifesto?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be still here, still queer in the face of everything that we've discussed?
One of the most striking things about the manifesto is how it reclaims the word queer.
Yeah.
It's not just a label anymore. It's like a verb,
Right.
a way of being that actively disrupts norms and expectations.
There's that line that I just love where they say, queer as in knowing that the desire to escape enslavement was once classified as a mental illness drapetomania because freedom itself was seen as pathological.
Yeah, that's so powerful because it highlights how systems of power use labels like mental illness to control people and maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
Anything that challenges their authority, anything that deviates from the norm gets pathologized.
And it's not just historical,
Yeah.
That same logic is still being used today to delegitimize trans experiences, neurodivergence,
Absolutely.
any form of difference that threatens those in power.
Right.
Another key principle of the manifesto, I think, is this refusal to make anyone comfortable.
Right.
It's this rejection of the idea that marginalized groups need to tone themselves down to assimilate, to make themselves palatable to those in power in order to be accepted.
Yeah.
It's like saying, we're not here to make you feel comfortable. We're here to challenge your assumptions. We're here to disrupt your norms. We're here to create space for ourselves and others who don't fit into your narrow definitions of what's acceptable.
It's about refusing to play by the rules of a game that's rigged against you,
Yeah.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it's about recognizing that true liberation requires us to embrace our differences, to be unapologetically ourselves, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
And the manifesto also takes on capitalism directly,
Right.
arguing that it can never be truly inclusive because it's fundamentally built on exploitation and inequality.
Yeah, there's that line where they say, queer as in capitalism requires poverty to function. A living wage for all is structurally impossible because the system demands a surplus of suffering to keep the machine running.
Yeah, it's this stark reminder that capitalism relies on this hierarchy where
Yeah.
some people benefit at the expense of others.
Exactly.
And that hierarchy is often based on things like race and class and gender and ability,
Yeah.
the very things that queerness and neurodiversity challenge.
Exactly.
Huh.
So the manifesto isn't just about dismantling those old systems of oppression.
Right.
It's about building something new in its place.
Yes.
Something that embraces fluidity
Yeah.
and rejects rigid categories and prioritizes care and mutual aid over competition and scarcity.
It's a vision of a world where difference is celebrated,
Yeah.
where everyone has the freedom to be their authentic selves, and where the systems that have created so much suffering are finally dismantled.
It's a beautiful vision, and it's one that's already being enacted by countless individuals and communities around the world.
Hmm.
You know?
So for those of us who are listening to this deep dive,
Yeah.
where do we go from here?
Right.
What can we do to put these principles into practice in our own lives?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the future isn't predetermined. It's being created right now by the choices we make, the actions we take, the communities we build. And Hoerricks' essay is a reminder that we have the power to shape that future.
And it starts with embracing our own queerness, our own neurodivergence,
Yeah.
our own unique ways of being in the world. It's about rejecting the pressure to conform, to assimilate, to make ourselves small in order to fit in.
It's about finding strength in our differences, connecting with others who share our values, and building communities that support and sustain us.
It's about being bold and defiant and unapologetically ourselves. It's about being still here, still queer, and refusing to let anyone erase our existence or silence our voices.
And as we navigate these really challenging times, you know, it's important to remember that hope is not a passive emotion.
Yeah.
It's a call to action. It's a belief that another world is possible and a commitment to doing the work to make that world a reality.
So to everyone listening, what will you do to embrace fluidity and nonconformity in your own life? What does a world beyond empire look like to you, and what role do you want to play in building it?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked some new ideas, challenged some old assumptions, and left you feeling inspired to create a more just and equitable world.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep being your amazing, authentic selves.